Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. On the heels of our recent severe weather outbreak, we have more severe weather that is on the way for parts of the central U.S. starting today, Tuesday, April 30th through tomorrow, Wednesday, May 1st, and likely onward from that period going into the weekend and into early next week. This video is going to focus on today and tomorrow as we have two areas that the SPC have highlighted with an enhanced risk level 3 out of 5. Today, that is centered from central Iowa down into northeast Kansas, large slight risk surrounding that as well. All hazards on the table for today. We have a tornado threat at a 5% level there from southern Minnesota down into eastern Nebraska, much of the western two-thirds of Iowa, northeast Missouri down into northwest Missouri into eastern Kansas. Large to very large hail is possible, especially within that enhanced risk area. Places like Des Moines, Kansas City down into eastern Kansas, Salina, Topeka, under the gun for that greatest severe hail threat. Could see some 2-3+ inch hailstones today. And then a large 15% hashed area down into the northern Oklahoma region. Damaging wind also going to be a threat, perhaps some significant gusts up there in the northern portions of the risk area. That is for today. Then we go into tomorrow. The SPC has an enhanced risk out for basically the center portion of Kansas. Places just west of Wichita, the I-70 corridor, Hayes, Russell, southward, Great Bend, down into southwest Kansas, Dodge City area, Greensburg, Pratt, under the gun for that enhanced risk area tomorrow, with a slight risk extending all the way down into far southwest Texas. Again, all hazards going to be on the table for tomorrow's risk. 5% tornado risk is on the table for that central Kansas corridor down in a narrow corridor along the dry line in the eastern Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma region. And we also have a large to very large hail threat, especially up there in the Kansas corridor. 30% hashed hail risk there for some very large to giant hailstones within that activity. 15% hashed area extending down the dry line as well into West Texas. Damaging wind also going to be a threat for tomorrow's activity. So an active couple of days coming up here across the central U.S., and we are expecting that to continue beyond that, but at this point the models kind of diverge on their solution. So we're going to focus on today and tomorrow in this video, and then as needed going forward, we'll have videos up as these setups come to fruition. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Here is our current 500 millibar pattern as shown by the SPC mesoanalysis page, and unlike the last several days that were part of that big severe weather outbreak, we do not have as meridional of flow across the region, not as deep digging of troughs across the region, mostly zonal flow across the U.S. at this point, and that is going to maintain itself through this next little stretch here. We do have a few little troughs that will be rotating through the flow. For example, this one here starting to impinge upon the central to northern plains, South Dakota, Nebraska region, and that will move to the east today, allowing for that severe threat up here across parts of Iowa into Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. Down to the south, we will maintain that zonal flow in a fairly weak capacity, so the forcing for ascent is going to be much weaker with southern extent down into southern Kansas, Oklahoma, into Texas today. Although we could see a couple storms develop down there, the forcing is going to be fairly weak, so we're going to need something else to initiate storms, whether that be a stronger pocket of heating. It's going to take a little bit extra to get storms down here along the dry line today, rather than up here where we have a little bit better forcing for ascent as this little shortwave moves into the central plains. So that is going to be really the pattern for the next couple of days. We're going to see this mostly zonal flow maintain itself, and then a couple of these little troughs rotating through the flow to provide just enough support on the large scale for severe storms in these environments. Down at the surface, as you might expect, not a very robust low-level response. We have seen some surface low development out here across the northern and central high plains here, up from South Dakota southward into Colorado. A couple different low centers there possibly, but we have started to see at least broad cyclogenesis, and that will continue to move off to the east today, perhaps tighten up a little bit as this trough does traverse the Rockies fully going into the afternoon hours today. Down to the south, not much of a surface low or surface cyclogenesis down here. So again, going to take some stronger pockets of heating likely to initiate storms down across parts of Texas and Oklahoma in today's setup and likely tomorrow's setup as well. But the greatest area of surface forcing here going to be along this surface low. We will have a cold front developing with this activity moving off to the east pretty quickly verging on surging, if you will. And so that should have some implications on the storm mode up here, especially across northern portions of the risk area, Nebraska, Iowa, northeast Missouri, perhaps far northwest Missouri, and far northeast Kansas. Whereas down to the south, not going to be crashing as hard, and therefore we could see a little bit better storm mode down here across parts of eastern Kansas into northern Oklahoma especially, and that could allow for some more photogenic supercells with a greater all hazards risk. But we'll dive into that here a little bit deeper in just a second. 850 millibar analysis low-level jet is situated in a plume across the plains here out of the south-southwest, 30 to 45 knots here across parts of the Dakotas southward into Kansas, Oklahoma, and West Texas. That should continue through the day, especially across northern portions of the risk area where we see that little bit better low-level cyclogenesis maintain itself throughout the day, and farther to the south, perhaps a little bit less low-level shear as a result of this weaker low-level jet. But we will start to see pretty strong moisture advection continue through the morning into the afternoon up here across these areas, and we're going to need it, as up here we are not situated in an area of very high dew points at the moment. Taking a look at our raw surface data here, I'll refresh this for our most recent look. But you can see here, up into Nebraska, Iowa, northwest Missouri, northeast Kansas, we are situated with 40s into the low 50s dew points here. So we're going to need rapid moisture advection. We're going to see probably just-in-time moisture up here, as our 60s dew points are situated basically here south of the Kansas-Oklahoma border. Our 60 dew point line, looks something like this here this morning. So we're going to need pretty rapid moisture advection northward into the region. And that should occur as that surface low kind of takes place and tightens just a little bit going into the afternoon. But we're going to need that to those 60s dew points to get up in here. And so moisture quality is a concern. The overall depth, even if the 60s dew points do get up here into this region, the moisture quality is going to be of concern. And we'll take a look at the soundings in just a second. But most robust moisture down here to the south, that should get up well into East Kansas through this afternoon. And I've been talking about this, amongst my chaser friends here for the last couple of days. But it looks to me like this eastern Kansas corridor is going to be that sweet spot between just enough flow aloft to support robust severe storms and better moisture down to the south, better moisture quality, especially at the surface down to the south here. Kind of that overlap looks to exist in this eastern Kansas corridor, and that may be our favorite corridor today for the most robust and perhaps photogenic severe storms with that all hazards threat. Up here to the north, moisture quality going to be waning, even though we do have stronger forcing for ascent. Down here, better moisture, better instability across the southern plains, but weaker forcing for ascent, and unclear, very conditional storm initiation opportunities. So that sweet spot looks to kind of be setting up there in eastern Kansas, as we'll have low to mid 60s dew points up here across this region, with just a nice glancing blow from the shortwave coming in across the central plains. Going to our soundings this morning, here we are at Norman at 12Z, and you can see the problems with the moisture quality here. Very limited low-level moisture beneath a stout capping inversion, probably stout elevated mixed layer that has advected its way into this region from the western plains, the central high plains out there to the west. Atop this shallow moist layer, leading to a lot of instability, a lot of elevated instability this morning, and that instability is expected to grow as we will have strong surface heating today across these regions, and the trough coming in should help erode that cap, especially across the northern half of the risk area, the eastern Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri corridor. But that moisture quality is a little bit of concern. Go down to the south here at Dallas-Fort Worth. Very shallow moisture as well. Some drier air just above that little shallow pocket of moisture at the surface, even though dew points at the surface very high. 69 over 69 here at the surface at Dallas at 12Z. That is a little bit of concern. That may also be an inhibiting factor farther south along the dry line for activity today, as updrafts may struggle. Even if they do try to initiate along the dry line, updrafts may struggle with that big pocket of dry air aloft. So we'll have to watch that for sure. The storm risk definitely with southern extent becomes more and more conditional, and because of this dry air, because of a lack of forcing. So definitely going to want to favor areas today up to the north near that surface low and cold front, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas for that best severe weather threat today. Up here to the north, again, we are just north of the best moisture at this point in the morning. So you can see some dry air there in the low to mid levels there. So we'll see if that works itself out going into the afternoon. But this low level air mass will be advecting into the region. So we probably will maintain some semblance of dry air aloft going into the afternoon across the northern half of the risk area. But we have some extra forcing for ascent that may help overcome that. And some drier air also could mean, as storms go, they could be a little bit more photogenic, a little bit more carved out if they can sustain themselves, which is a pretty good bet today given those forcing mechanisms at play, despite a little bit of thermodynamic issues with this setup. All right, let's dive into some model data. This is the 12Z NAM that is coming in hot off the press as we are recording this video. 500 millibars to start out. Here is our initialization. You can see that little bit of a shortwave moving through the flow, mostly zonal flow across the entire continental U.S. Again, not expected to change a whole lot over the next couple of days, with the exception of these few little shortwaves that will be rotating through the flow. For today, you can see that little shortwave does take on a little bit more of a negative tilt, becomes a little bit more evident going into the afternoon, but here we are at 0Z with this strong belt of flow on the backside of this little kink in the height contours there, indicative of a pretty strong maturing shortwave here. That is going to take aim across northern portions of the risk area, southern Minnesota, southeast South Dakota, Nebraska, into western Iowa. And again, areas farther south, the farther away you go from this jet streak, we will have less and less forcing and therefore a more conditional threat for storm initiation, given very weak forcing for ascent. Down here in Kansas, a little bit of a more glancing blow, still some slightly stronger flow aloft, but again, that's going to be that sweet spot between slightly stronger flow aloft and a glancing blow from the shortwave, as well as a little bit better moisture located down here to the south compared to areas farther north. But up here into Nebraska and Iowa, that is going to be a very fast-moving shortwave through the flow. That is going to allow that surface low to develop a little bit through the day and that cold front to really start surging off to the east. Let's go down to the surface here. And so you can see we start off here with that very broad surface cyclone across the central and northern high plains. That continues to move off to the east through the day. Tries to tighten up a little bit, maybe here going toward the end of the afternoon, early evening today. But again, you can see how progressive it is. We start out here, broad surface low, cold front develops through much of the day, and that really starts to get shunted off to the east pretty quickly. And you can see how that fast that surface low is going. Here we go, 18Z, the center of the surface low right in here, and we go towards 0Z in just a 6-hour period. That is all the way up in here. So pretty fast-moving surface low here, and therefore that will mean a fast-moving surface features like the cold front. Down here to the south, that cold front will be draped down to the southwest, and we'll have kind of a dry line feature down here to the south as well. That will be our main initiating boundaries for convection in this environment. Let's take a look at the moisture here, and you can see those boundaries a little bit better. So we start off the day, very limited moisture here up to the north. Best moisture down here in Oklahoma, southward into Texas. That will continue to stream its way northward through the afternoon. And by early afternoon, we'll have 50s dew points up here into Nebraska and Iowa. Still on the lower side for a robust severe weather risk. By 4 p.m., we start to see at least splotchy 60s up in here, but it's not really a widespread area of 60s dew points up into the enhanced risk region here. Down to the south, though, different story. Low to mid 60s dew points across eastern Kansas, and southward, much more robust moisture as well. Oklahoma into Texas, we have some 70s dew points there with the purple colors. So much more robust moisture farther to the south. Much less moisture here at the surface farther north. We do get kind of a tongue of 60s dew points up in here, but in a very narrow capacity by early evening. But you can see how fast this cold front is going to eject off to the east, especially going toward the early evening time frame. You see here we get that moisture that is still streaming up. That's why I'm calling this kind of just-in-time moisture for the northern portion of the risk area. Still streaming up, moving off to the north and east, and then immediately as that cold front hits it, we're going to shunt that off to the east. And that should really bring an end to the notable tornado and hail chances and foster more of a damaging wind risk as those storms get congealed along that line. You can see down to the south, however, that the boundary does not really move a whole lot throughout the day. And then you see there during the evening, we just kind of see even a sloshing back here of the boundary. The dry line portion down here to the south sloshes back to the west ever so slightly south of that cold frontal intrusion. Here in East Kansas, again, not really much influence from that cold front. And that, again, could foster a little bit more of a longer window for discrete supercells in this environment. Let's go take a little bit of a closer look here. We'll take a look at our Central Plains sector. So here we go, 1821Z. We'll take a sounding up here in far eastern Nebraska, right at the nose of those 60s dew points there. Again, going to be very splotchy 60s dew points up there, but it could be enough to support robust severe storms. But again, it is on the low side. Given that we should be fairly warm in this environment as well, NAM does tend to underdo the surface temperatures, as we know. This is not all that favorable of a profile for tornadic activity. You can see here, we have plenty of instability, thermodynamics not all that bad at all. Very robust instability, 2,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, 75 over 60 at the surface. I have a feeling that those surface temperatures are a little bit on the low side given strong surface heating up here. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at NWS Omaha. As I've done this in videos past, we kind of just click on a point here. Let's take a look just northeast of the Columbus, Nebraska area. See what their high temperature is. So their high temperature getting up to 78 degrees today there. So definitely on the NAM is underdoing those surface temperatures perhaps just a little bit. And we could even get up into the low 80s, which would make these temperature dew point spreads a little bit on the higher side for significant tornadic activity. But nonetheless, it is kind of right on the margins for tornadic activity, but our wind profiles, not all that favorable. You can see here, very limited low-level shear, very unidirectional wind profile in the lowest kilometer or 2 or even 3 kilometers there in the low levels of the atmosphere. Those winds out of the south-southwest up through a fairly deep layer up above 850 millibars. So very unidirectional flow in the low levels, not much change in wind speed as well. So very limited low-level shear, and that should foster more of a large hail threat with initial supercells, and then a quick transition to a line going into the early evening as that cold front starts to take over and surge off to the east. Speaking of early evening, let's go ahead and take a look here at eastern Iowa. We might get a little bit better moisture up in there by early evening. This is at 0Z, so 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And yeah, that's not all that favorable. That could be just a little bit of a wonky nature here. So our cold front looks to be out in here. So that's something to note as well. Our actual cold front boundary is right in here across Iowa, western Iowa, and our moisture almost relegated behind the cold front. That's how fast this cold front will be moving. And so our warm sector ahead of the front looks to be very, very narrow. And so let's take a sounding here just at the eastern edge of the moisture. So it looks like the storms here along the cold front, which will force those storms, may start to outrun that narrow warm sector up here. And it's hard to get a sounding without contamination here. Let's try and see if we can do that up into western Iowa. So this is a little bit better here for sure, off to the south and southeast of that cold frontal boundary. Decent instability, 1,700 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. Strongly veering and strengthening winds with height, so certainly an improvement over what we saw earlier. But the question is, by this time, are we going to have discrete supercells left? And I think the answer is going to be no, as that cold front's going to start taking over, and our storms may start to outrun the moisture axis here across western Iowa. So it should be a fairly quick transition to a line up here, especially going into the early evening hours, as that surface boundary shunts well off to the east. Here we are at 3Z. The cold front appears to be well out in here, and then our moisture axis is located to the west of the cold front. So that is something to note there. I think we will have too skinny of an instability axis to support robust tornadic activity here. Could see a few spin-ups along the line, but the cold front's located kind of at the eastern edge of the moisture reserve here up into parts of Iowa. And so that will storms will have a tendency to outrun that moisture axis pretty quickly, I suspect, up here across northern portions of the risk area. Farther south, you see across Kansas, a little bit better moisture. Here is kind of that, our dry line begins here across north central Kansas. Let's take a sounding here at, we'll take one here at 21Z, so 4 p.m., kind of between the Wichita and Topeka areas there in east central Kansas. Starting to be a pretty favorable sounding for a robust severe threat, robust instability for sure, 3,800 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, very strong instability here, 82 over 67 at the surface. Surface temperatures could be a little bit higher than that, but very robust instability here, with a hodograph that does favor severe weather. Start to see limited low-level shear here to start with, but plenty of shear for supercells. And again, we probably will see a much more discrete mode down here. So here is that initiating boundary. And our shear vectors are definitely perpendicular to that boundary, almost purely perpendicular to the boundary, which again, we've talked about how that can be almost too much of a good thing as we have more storm interactions at that point, and that can make for a slightly more messy mode, but still, we should have a window for discrete supercells along the southern portions of the boundary. You can see up here that cold front, a little bit worse angle between those shear vectors with that initiating boundary. And again, the surging nature of the cold front will undermine any discrete supercell attempts, at least a longer window for discrete supercells. But down here across Kansas, looks like we'll have a nice window for discrete supercells here, perhaps some slightly southeastward moving supercells, and that should be a favorable situation for robust severe weather. Let's take a look here at East Kansas here at 0Z, and we're going to start to see some favorable looking hodographs here. This is a pretty classic looking hodograph for some epic storm structure, including an all hazards threat as well. Very strong instability here, 4,400 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape. That is incredible instability here, especially for late April across Kansas. This is something you'd often see down in Texas, perhaps closer to the moisture source. But over here into East Kansas, I do suspect that these dew points are a little bit on the high side. I don't know if we'll reach 70s dew points here across this region. Those 70s dew points, let's take a look here on our current surface map. Those 70s dew points are really relegated down here well to the south across southeast Texas. So I do suspect that this is going to be overestimating moisture a little bit, but nonetheless, even if we have dew points in the mid-60s, 65, 66 or so, it's still going to foster very robust instability. And this is a hodograph that is favorable for slow-moving, structured supercells. Strongly veering and strengthening winds in the low levels of the atmosphere, plenty of deep layer shear, 40-plus knots for supercells, and lots of streamlines vorticity in the low levels of the hodograph. You can see here as we take a look at our shear vectors, our storm relative wind vector, and our horizontal vorticity vector. Those are fairly parallel to each other here in the lowest kilometer or so of the atmosphere, and that is going to lead to perhaps quite a bit of structure, especially as we go into early evening and we get a little bit of convective inhibition to work its way back in. That combo of slight convective inhibition and strong streamlines vorticity in the low levels of the hodograph often fosters very incredible storm structure. And so those chasing today, I think that eastern Kansas portion of the risk is going to be that favored corridor for some well-structured supercells along that dry line / cold front. Also could see a low-end tornado threat as well. Strongly veering and strengthening winds with height here in the low levels of the atmosphere. Plenty of curvature in the hodograph there with streamlines vorticity in the low levels, almost 300 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. So we could see a tornado or two, especially if we are fully uncapped here, like the NAM is showing. So all in all, a very favorable look here for some beautiful supercells this afternoon into early evening across eastern Kansas. Down here into Oklahoma becomes a little bit more questionable, and as well into Texas about storm initiation today. But you see here we are uncapped, so plenty of instability for storms down here. Kind of the same looking hodograph as we see in Kansas, although much weaker deep layer shear, still adequate for supercells. So if a storm can fire, it will have those same characteristics likely as the Kansas stuff: slow moving, well structured, some type of all hazards threat. But I do question the degree of coverage down here, as the forcing is going to be very, very weak, and thus we may not see any storms fire at all. But if we do, it could be quite photogenic and foster that low-end all hazards risk. But again, I think that sweet spot is going to be up there in Kansas, where we have a little bit stronger forcing to initiate some storms along that surface boundary. All right, let's take a look at some convection allowing models for today's setup. This is the 12Z HRRR. And as we go into the afternoon, you'll see quite a bit of elevated convection here north of the warm front across far southeast South Dakota, southern Minnesota, northwest Iowa. Not going to be too much of an impact on our main severe weather setup for later on. You'll see as we go into the afternoon, we start to see some more robust updrafts here across Iowa, western Iowa. This might be a little bit too far east. I suspect storms will probably fire out here across eastern Nebraska. This is at 5 p.m. Central Daylight Time. You can see a pretty quick transition to more of a linear organization of the storms, maybe a couple more robust supercells toward the tail end of the line, but fairly quick transition to a linear mode up there for the reasons we suggested earlier. Down here in Kansas, you can see much more cellular development up here from far northeast Kansas southwestward along the frontal zone and dry line. Much more cellular development, discrete supercell development. That maintains itself for a few hours here. You see some very semi-discrete supercells here. Again, that would foster that all hazards threat, including the threat for tornadoes, large to very large hail, and also some epic structure. We see a few updrafts down here into northwest Texas, And then we see going into the evening hours, those storms wane a little bit, moving into northern Oklahoma as more of a linearly organized system before waning here in the overnight hours into tomorrow morning. So interesting setup for today, once again, here on the HRRR. Quick transition to a linear mode, and again, fairly quick, perhaps outrunning of the moisture axis out here across parts of Iowa. Let's just see, those storms are located right in here. So here is our line of storms. I'm going to put that in just kind of a line here. Then we'll see where the moisture axis is. So let's see. So here on the HRRR, we see quite a bit of overmixing, which is not a typical, which is pretty typical for the HRRR. So actually, let me go ahead and go back here. So those storms are located right in here. And then we'll put on our moisture map. So take this with a grain of salt, but so you can see that our storms here are kind of on the back side of the surface low, maybe on the back side of that surface front. So there could be even some tendency for storms to be undercut, but very limited moisture out ahead of this, not much moisture axis out ahead of these storms. So that could be a concern there. Would foster mostly a large hail and damaging wind threat. Tornado threat is definitely in question the farther north you go. With the setup down here, much better moisture out ahead of these storms, much more real estate for those storms in Kansas to work with down here along the cold front and dry line. Let's take a look at another convection allowing model here. Here's the NSSL WRF, and I'll go back here to our reflectivity. So here is the NSSL WRF, and by mid-afternoon or so, we see quite a few storms develop there. Pretty clustered mode up here initially. Interestingly, on the NSSL WRF here, we see quite a bit of development down here across Kansas into Oklahoma. I question this being too much. I question this kind of coverage here across this area, given weak forcing for ascent with southern extent. We do see some slightly more cellular development here in Kansas, but a quick transition to a line, very widespread convection here from southeast Kansas into northern Texas. Again, I do question that. I don't think this solution is going to end up coming to fruition. But overall, lots of storms in Iowa, clustered mode up there, some cellular development there in Kansas with a line down to the south. I'm not sure that southern portion is going to play out as the model has it here. The ARW model not quite out far enough yet, but we'll see the early portions here. And we do see some kind of clustered, weaker updrafts up here across Iowa, up down here in Kansas, some more cellular development as well, and some semblance of development here in northwest Texas. Perhaps where stronger heating is taking place down here along the dry line, that could be an impetus for storm development down there. But again, I think coverage will remain isolated at best across Oklahoma into Texas. But here across eastern Kansas, looks like the start of a favorable, somewhat cellular mode compared to areas farther north. All right, let's talk about tomorrow now. We'll go back to the NAM, and we'll start this evening with the 500 millibar pattern. Here's that lead shortwave associated with the severe threat today, going to move off quickly to the north and northeast. And behind that, we'll see there's just a broad swath of southwesterly flow in its wake across much of the central high to northern high plains. Associated with this kind of just broad trough across, centered across southern Canada, broad, kind of some kinks in the height contours there across the western U.S., But you'll notice here that we're not really being influenced all that much by this trough. We're a little bit farther removed from this trough going into the afternoon tomorrow. So forcing is going to be on the weaker side with this setup. So we're going to need a little bit of help in areas where we have some surface boundaries, some stronger heating, is where we're going to see the best chances for storm initiation. Up here in Kansas, we do see a little bit of a glancing blow, a little bit of stronger flow here in the mid-levels. That should help things out across this region. With southern extent, that mid-level flow drops off in intensity, and so we're going to, and so does the overall forcing. So we're going to need some help here down in the southern portions of the risk area to see robust storm coverage, whether that's surface boundaries, stronger surface heating. We'll take a look at that here in just a second. The overall pattern here, not all that conducive, a little bit different from what we saw with this last outbreak where we had these deep digging troughs impinge upon the warm sector here. Not so much the case here, mostly just broad southwesterly flow across these regions. Let's go down to the surface, see how things play out here at the surface. So here we go into, this evening, we start to see renewed cyclogenesis here across eastern Colorado, southeast Colorado, eastern New Mexico, going into the morning hours tomorrow. Then as that stronger southwesterly flow traverses the Rockies, we'll see surface low development here in eastern Colorado, eastern New Mexico, and that will tighten up going into the afternoon. Here we are at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. So our surface low well back here to the west with a warm front draped off to the northeast. southeast. And so that may be that looks to be a favored area for storm initiation there along this boundary. And then we'll have our dry line draped down to the south. We'll take a look at our moisture here in just a second, but that should be another favored boundary for storm initiation in this environment if we can get some help along that dry line given weaker forcing. So we'll take a look here. We'll zoom into our sectors, our Southern Plains sector here, and take a look at our moisture. So moisture here, if we go back to this evening, we'll have a nice broad swath of 60s and 70s dew points here. Perhaps not quite 70s dew points. NAM may be overdoing things a little bit, but we could have 70s dew points here near the Red River by this evening. Those will continue to stream northward, and that dry line is going to slosh back to the west during the overnight hours and set up there across parts of the Texas Panhandle into southwest Kansas by tomorrow afternoon. So interestingly enough here, the NAM is not progging far northward advance of the warm sector here. You see these dew points and these red contours, that's your lifted index, an instability measure. And you can see that we have much weaker moisture and very limited lifted index values here along the warm front and just south across parts of Kansas. So that could be an indication of ample morning convection here that we're going to have to watch out. And as we saw on the HRRR model, from this morning, if we go back here to our 12Z HRRR, you see that as we go into the overnight hours, we have the storms from Kansas persist into Oklahoma going into the overnight hours, and this complex kind of sits around here across northeast Oklahoma for much of the morning. Assuming that this is fairly potent, this is going to start producing some outflow, and that outflow may force the moisture to stay relegated here to areas south of the outflow and south and west of the outflow boundary. So that could be a complicating factor here for parts of the Kansas portion of the risk area tomorrow morning. If we don't have as much morning convection here and less outflow reinforcing the warm front, then we will see a more robust setup develop here. But that is going to be something we're going to have to watch here for the Kansas portions of the risk area. Favored areas are going to probably be again south and west of any morning convection. And so you can see that here on the NAM, we have a little bit better corridor of moisture up here right on the warm front and dry line intersection right up there into southwest Kansas. So we're going to have to watch that for sure. NAM is definitely showing this solution as well. And I'll take a sounding here from this kind of lower moisture area south of the actual warm front, and you'll see here that the atmosphere may be a little bit overworked. We can't get that robust moisture up into this region, and you can see that very limited thermodynamics here despite a strong wind profile. So that is going to be something to watch here for the Kansas portion of the risk. Down along the dry line, looks like a little bit better untapped air mass here ahead of the dry line from far southwest Kansas into the Texas Panhandle. So if we can get some stronger heating here along the dry line, we're going to perhaps see a better chance for storm initiation. But again, it's going to take a lot, given much weaker forcing down here across these regions. So we'll take a sounding here. Again, we'll take one here, kind of the eastern Texas Panhandle here, and maybe one down here across the Texas South Plains region. So here we are, 21Z, very robust instability here, 4,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, but very limited wind profiles here. Deep layer shear only at 30 knots, so that is on the margins for supercells for sure. Very limited low-level shear as well. So that is going to foster more of a large hail and damaging wind risk. Tornado risk probably on the low side there. With farther south extent, much worse wind profiles here, 20 knots of bulk shear, so that would favor more of a multi-cell mode with southern extent along the dry line. And so up here, it's going to be definitely a challenge here. The NAM's certainly progging a lot of morning convection and not a lot of recovery across these areas. So there may be quite a narrow corridor here along the dry line ahead of the warm front where we have an untapped air mass, but that could be a fly in the ointment for tomorrow, that morning convection. We're going to have to watch that for sure to see if that does persist. If not, then we'll have a much more robust event up here in Kansas, but the NAM certainly is showing a less robust event for the Kansas portion of the risk. Let's see here. I'm curious. Let's take a look at the GFS model here. So the GFS certainly is on the opposite end of the guidance. A lot more robust moisture return into Kansas with less morning convection. And you can see, we'll take a sounding here up just south of the warm front. And that should lead to a more robust environment in Kansas for an all hazards threat there. And we'll see if this loads here. This is going to be the 6Z GFS, 12Z GFS not quite out yet, but you can see a much more favorable environment for robust severe weather. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow. Strong instability, strong low-level and deep layer shear to favor that all-hazards threat, and that this solution would mean a much less robust morning complex of convection. So Model differences still exist for this setup tomorrow, especially across the Kansas portion of the risk. So we're going to have to watch. If we have ample morning convection here, that is going to nix a lot of the risk for a good portion of Kansas here. And then the dry line would be your favorite area of storm initiation in this environment, although, again, weaker forcing may preclude overall widespread coverage along the dry line with southern extent. So that's going to do it for this video. Hope you got some details on this upcoming setup. Definitely a potent looking setup, not nearly as potent as it was over the last few days this past weekend, but we still will see some significant severe weather chances across this area. Again, for today, enhanced risk from the western Iowa, central western Iowa down into northeast Kansas. Large slight risk surrounding that. All hazards on the table for today, that 5% risk area. Again, I'm not sure if storm mode will allow for a more robust event up here across Nebraska and Iowa, but farther to the south, where the storm mode is expected to be a little bit more cellular, a little bit more discrete, we could see a bit better chance for tornadoes there. Again, some epic structure also on the table for these areas. Large to very large hail going to be a threat, as well as damaging winds across these areas today. And then we go into tomorrow, enhanced risk across much of Kansas. SPC does see that severe threat materializing across Kansas, hence the enhanced risk. But again, some of the models showing that robust morning convection, which could be a fly in the ointment for the setup up there. Slight risk down the dry line for the threat for all hazards. Tornadoes on the table, 5% risk area there, as well as large to very large hail and damaging winds. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.